All right, so after a lot of rain, we have a little bit of break and have some sun. So what we want to do is work inside the engine bay and get some hoses replaced. We have a ton of vacuum hoses. They are everywhere and they are rubber and dry. So like take the boost hose and I can break it like it's spaghetti. And so what we want to do is go ahead and replace it with silicone. And there is a lot. So now that we have the plenum off, that's another thing while we're in there, is to go down on the sides and around the engine and replace those hoses. Because ultimately, the best time to do it is when the engine is out, but we're not pulling this engine just yet. So we're gonna go through and replace all the hoses. There's 4mm, 6mm, and 8mm, and as well some of the coolant lines. So all the hoses are updated with silicone, went and did the coolant hose as well, and then of course marked the vacuum lines where they all go so it makes more sense when we get to that point. The next thing I want to do is start taking a look at this harness. They ran lines that were separate to the injectors, and so my concern is there's a problem somewhere in the harness with that wire. So what I'm going to do is go ahead and pull all of this loom off. It's dried electric tape. And as well, I took the brackets off the back, and there's one bolt down here that when I pull the transmission, I'm going to have to loosen that bolt. But for now, I can go through and just clean this up and find where the issue was and why they ran these extra wires for the injectors. All right, so off camera, what we've done is we've gone and actually repainted the battery tray, so that looks a lot nicer, and as well, gave a good clean to the firewall and the surrounding metal and got a lot of the grease and the oil out. And so now with the wiring harness, we have uncovered all sorts of cracked wires. And so what we need to do is get some replacement harnesses and get those spliced in. And I think this will be able to be at least utilized until we pull the engine down the road someday and just replace the entire harness. But we can get this back up and running nice and clean and not use these T-taps for the, and that's a great example actually right there, is these T-taps can break wires very easily. So sometimes these are great, you know, in certain situations, but when it comes to an engine, I wouldn't use them. You know, always best to solder, of course. So what we're gonna do is actually work on getting the valve covers off and get those cleaned up and painted so we can get this portion of the engine done, because everything else is ready to go. So let's go ahead and get those off. We're going to start by taking the cover for the spark plugs, and then we'll pull that off and then start pulling the valve covers off. Now the good news about the wiring harness was I've purchased most of the harnesses that I need, and then I was able to find a donor at the pick and pull that had a brand new harness in it, so I was able to get all of those harnesses I think that I need, so we should be good. The other thing is we have the Z-Spec bolt kit, so we'll be able to replace these Phillips head bolts as well that kind of are a pain. And we also have the new seals for this part. Now the one thing I want to do first, before I pull the actual cover off, is get rid of all this dust and grime and oxidation, because I don't want that to fall into the head. So we just have a toothbrush, just push this junk all down, and then we'll vacuum this out. Now, why didn't I just vacuum this out first? That's a great question. But hindsight's always 20/20. Then we'll want to undo this clip. And actually, we have the hose for this, so we'll just undo it completely. And for now, while we work on this other cover, we're gonna just take our shirt here, cover up that opening. All right, so now what we're gonna do is pull off the bolts of the other valve cover. All right, we're gonna use a little suggestion here. Tapping it with the rubber mallet. There we go. There we go. So now we'll want to go ahead and clean this all up. And then as well, we'll go ahead and just kind of look it over. Check out the guides on the cams, and then we'll go ahead and tackle the driver's side. So now we've got the valve covers off and we were cleaning them, and this is all covered up, so at least we're somewhat protected. But check this out. This was one of the rubber hoses, and this stuff is just breaking apart. So we're gonna replace all these with silicone hoses, just like we did for the smaller ones. And even this, one of the pipes came out, so we're gonna have to fix that, probably with some RTV. So we'll get these all nice and cleaned, and then a little bit of scuff sanding going so we get a good adhesion with the paint. And then we'll get those back on, and then we'll get these harnesses fixed. So now with the valve covers painted, and I'm about to put them in, but before I did that, I really wanted to get this wiring harness out. And this is the engine wiring harness. It runs from the passenger footwell all the way into the engine bay, and then around the engine and to the front as the farthest point for the mass airflow sensor. Now, it took a lot of advice and a lot of other YouTube videos to figure out how to get that harness out with the engine in. And the biggest thing was this plate. This plate sits behind in the footwell of the wiring harness and bolts in 2 points to the firewall. So let me show you what I had to do to get it out. So now coming over here, and this is the back of the engine, is I undid the AC line cover and seal, and you can see this stud right here. This is the stud that bolts right here. With one of my box end wrenches, it has a really thin wall, and it also is slightly angled. I was able to loosen the nut and then use my fingers to loosen it and get it off. And then for inside the footwell, there's a bolt right below the air conditioning heater air box, and unbolted that, and then just use a screwdriver to get this plate out. Now, I wanted to take this harness out. You know, I'm not going to be replacing it, but I am going to fix it. And the big thing was the previous owner had someone install wires to each injector. So I want to make sure that this harness works just fine by itself, and I don't want extra wires being run. And so took it out, and now we're going to go through and then fix all of these broken plugs, because I have a feeling that has a lot to do with it. I mentioned it earlier, you know, some of these ends, the wiring is dry and cracked. So we're gonna go ahead and replace those and get rid of these T-taps. You even have the T-taps on the inside next to the ECU. This was where that wiring was for the injectors. So I'm gonna clean it up, retape the entire thing, and then of course use some temperature tape in certain areas and get this thing perfect, or close to it perfect. All right, so we've got the wiring harness laid out on the table here, and the big thing is off camera, I pulled all the old loom, all the electric tape. There are a few sleeves on here that I need to pull off, but I'll do that when I disconnect the harnesses. But the big thing here is at every junction, there's a little zip tie, and I just bought a bag of cheap zip ties. And that way I know where to tape to, and also just where kind of everything lines up. So the big things that I'm going to do with this wiring harness, if you remember, we had these T-taps that they ran wires from here through the firewall and connected them to the injector wires for some reason. So what I want to do first of all is remove these. I'm going to use liquid tape just because there's just the pierce of the insulation of the wire. If there is any broken or a failure on the wire, then I'll solder it and then heat shrink it. But as far as that's what we're going to do here. And then for all these ends, I have a bag of either new harnesses, or one of the cars that I went at Pick and Pull had a brand new harness, and I just bought the harnesses off of that, so to speak. So we're going to do a lot of pulling, replacing, taping, and then also I've got some insulating tape, DEI cool tape. That will go in some key spots near the turbo and at the back of the engine. And we are using a cloth. It's similar to Tessa tape, which can withstand heat really well. So now I'm going to go through this and start cleaning this thing up. All right, so off camera, I've been working on the harness and just repairing all of these plugs, and the majority of them were all messed up, and I'll show you those in a bit, but wanted to walk you through on how I repair these harnesses. You can see someone already did in the past. So let me set this camera down and I'll show you my steps. All right, so for this wire, we can see, you know, it's kind of bent and darkened, and it's actually really frail. Like I could break this wire, and actually I just did right there. So if you can see, it's cracking the casing of the wire. So back here is a lot nicer. So what I want to do is take my new harness and I match up the lengths to about where I want to cut. So I'll probably go back this far on the stock wire. So I'll cut those. And I want a slight overlap, about 10 millimeters or so, of the new harness. So I'm going to cut that about here. So now I can put the old harness to the side to keep track of my colors. And what I mean by that is I want to keep in mind what wire goes to which wire of the harness and what direction. So we'll put that to the side and our new harness to the side. And now I'm going to strip these wires back about that 10 millimeters. And I'm going to fan them out just a little bit. Now, I don't know if the camera can pick this up, but these are corroded slightly. So what I have here in these cut off solo cups is I have salt and then a white distilled vinegar in this one, and this is baking soda and water. And what I'm going to do is soak these two wires in the vinegar for a couple minutes, and the acid from the vinegar will eat away the corrosion. And then once that's done, I'm going to dip it into the baking soda solution to neutralize the acids. So I'm going to let that sit. So about 20 minutes have gone by, and let's take a look. And what we want to do is take this directly from the salt and vinegar into the baking soda and water. And that will neutralize the acid. And then we just dry that up, and that looks 100 times better. All right, so what we're gonna do now is we've got our wires all clean and they look good, so we just wanna make sure we fan them out, and we take our new harness and we're gonna strip the wires back on that. Now that we've got the harness stripped, what we wanna do is put some heat shrink tubing on. You can of course use electric tape, but I wouldn't suggest it. Spend a couple bucks and get some heat shrink, and it'll look nicer and it'll work better, and it won't be sticky like electric tape, and it won't fall off like electric tape. All right, so we fan that out, and by fanning, just mean that the wires look kind of like a little fan. And use our old harness to line it up. We're going green to the larger white with black. Push those together. And having one of these third hand or soldering stands really comes in handy, literally, no pun intended. To hold that, we've got our solder. We have our solder iron over here, or soldering iron over here. And I'm just gonna get these wires hot. Really should have a fan blowing because you don't want to breathe this stuff in. I'm just running the solder over the bare wire. Now we can use our heat shrink, put that over, and I've got my heat gun. And you can use a torch, you can use a lighter, you can use a match. You just want a lot of heat. Now I can go on to the other wire and I'll do that off camera. And so there's our outcome. So we've got a nice repair on this wire and this harness. And so now what we want to do is I'm using Red Wolf, but you can use Tessa tape, which is a cloth-based tape. So it's great for heat in the engine bay, and it protects the wires from drying out like these all did. So I'm just gonna go ahead and tape this up. All right, so now this wiring harness section is done. So what I need to do is go ahead and tape these all. This is one of my junctions. I removed these two wires so I could fix them. So I'll want to go ahead and tape this all the way up the line to the main, and we're almost finished. There was one harness here that I'm waiting to get in the mail. It was broken and it seemed fine when I was looking everything over, but it broke when I was trying to repair it. So we got a new harness for that. All right, so the wiring harness is all done and repaired, and just a couple things I've added. I added some DEI cool tape in just kind of those areas that are going to be like, this is the back of the engine, and then the side of the engine where it's going to be a little more heat from the turbos and the headers. And the other thing I did is I went through with my multimeter and checked all my wires, and they're good. And then I took my labeler and labeled all the fuel injection harnesses and the coil harnesses, so I know which cylinder they go to, so I don't have to do it while it's going into the car. So this will go back in, and then we're gonna start working on assembling the fuel injectors to the fuel rails so we can put that in, and then eventually get the intake plenum on. All right, so in the previous video, we cleaned out our fuel injectors. These are the 555 Nismo fuel injectors, the old style. And so what we want to do is go ahead and put a new seal kit on and install them in the fuel rails. And the way we're going to do that is using a little bit of motor oil, light motor oil on the seals, and just get them up and over on the injector up to the neck, and then the bottom seal, and then very carefully twist them in till they seat. And then we have bolt kit from Z-Spec, which highly recommend these. And we have that whole kit for the engine, which is gonna be great. And we're gonna use our caps. And then we need to replace the old fuel line that goes in between the two fuel rails. And so we have new high pressure fuel line for that. So we're gonna cut that to length and get going on these seals. And for the fuel line that goes in between the rails, we just need 4 1/4 inches. It could be roughly, I'm measuring it. All right. All right, so we've got our hose clamps and we've got our hose cut, and I'm just gonna put a little bit of WD-40 on the ends just to help it go on a little easier. And slide our clamp on. So now we've got our kit. And we have a few seals in here. So So we have this half moon shape, which this guy, if it focuses, he is going to sit in the top of the cap. All right, so we've got our injector, we've got our seals. We're just gonna take a little bit of oil, not a lot, and just oil the O-ring down. Then this is just allows it to move a lot easier. And pull it over the injector and have it sit in the shoulder. And the smaller one, we'll take our oil, rub it around, place it on the bottom, and I'm just gonna wipe off some of the oil that I put on the injector. And making sure the plug stays out, we're gonna very carefully slide it in, push till it seats, and just give it a little bit of pressure until it seats right in there. Then we will take our cap, making sure our little half moon seal is in the top, and then assemble our bolt for one side, and then very carefully tightening down somewhat equally on each side so you don't bind the injector until the cap is fully seated and your bolts are tight. Now what I'm gonna do is save the last seal. This is for the bottom, and this goes into the intake manifold, which sits right here. So we're gonna save these for when we install it on the car. I'm gonna go ahead and do the rest of these, and then I'll bring you up to speed where we're at. All right, so now we have a finished fuel rail. We already added the hose for the damper and for the fuel regulator. So this is all set to go into the car. So we'll go ahead and do that. All right, so we've pre-oiled all of the O-rings, and we put on our insulators, and we're just gonna carefully position them into place and then install our bolts. All right, so now we have it installed. Now I'm gonna go back through and just torque the bolts down to spec, and also started getting the harness in. So getting that all situated and back in the car. All right, so we've got the wiring harness in, and all the brackets through the back of the engine are in and tightened, and also put in the new silicone heater core hoses. So those are in since we have the space. So now what we're gonna do is get the VTC solenoids RTV'd in and get ready to put the valve covers on. All right, so we've got the valve covers in and already started hooking up some of the wires and cleaning them up as well and routing them. So we've got the intake hoses on order, so those should be in. So the next thing we need to do is get the intake plenum on and mounted, but that's gonna take a little bit of effort because I've got to rebuild the throttle bodies and as well the throttle body drum assembly in the center. So that's all that I have time for today. So thanks so much for watching. Stay tuned for the next videos on the 300ZX.